Tiwari, along with Ayan, Rakshit, would like to welcome you to this panel discussion between Professor Michel Danino and Professor Rita Kothari on the topic India and the idea of secularism. The discussion attempts to engage with academics as well as popular questions about secularism in India. What is secularism? How does religion figure in discourse of secularism? Is their relationship antagonistic or constitutive? How does secularism engage with minorities? And what are the risks of this engagement? How does secularism inform the idea of India and vice versa? These are some of the difficult questions that have been the subject of debate among various scholars and thinkers. Now I would request Ayan to introduce the speakers.
Michel Danino is a French-born Indian citizen, a writer, researcher, and historian, who happens to be a member of the Indian Council of Historical Research. And he was awarded recently the Padma Shri. His research interests are diverse, and he has been a prominent voice in the field of ancient Indian history and civilization. He has authored works in English and French, and has widely written about India's scientific heritage, its ecological traditions, and the challenges of Indian culture today. His notable works include The Invasion That Never Was, Indian Culture and India's Future, and The Lost River on the Trail of Saraswati, among many others. We are honored to have you, Professor Danino. Rita Kothari is a prolific translator, academic, and writer. She translated the first Dalit novel in Gujarati, Joseph Makwan's Angaliyat, as the stepchild in English, and more recently, Ila Mehta's Vaad as Fence. She has also contributed to the archive of partition studies by writing about Sindhi identities on the border in works such as The Burden of the Refuge, the Sindhi Hindus of Gujarat, Unbordered Memories, Partition Stories from the Sindh, and Memories and Movements. Her notable academic writings include Translating India, The Cultural Politics of English, and Chutneyfying India, The Phenomena of English, where she examines the place of English in the changing languages of urban contexts. We are also honored to have you here, Professor Kothari. I shall now move on to explain the course of our discussion today. The first round will feature opening remarks from each of the speakers, where each speaker will get 5 minutes to make initial submissions on the topic, India and the idea of secularism. The second round will feature 2 questions of the moderators to the speakers, which both the speakers will have to answer. The third round will involve an exchange of questions between the 2 speakers, where speakers will get to ask each other and comment upon the views of each other. Both speakers will get 1 minute to prepare at least 1 question for the other speaker. The fourth round shall feature closing remarks from each speaker of 2 minutes. After this, finally, we shall have a question round where the audience will get to ask the speakers questions. We shall now move on to the discussion. Before we do so, we request the audience to keep their mobile phones on silent.
Hello. Now I would like to request Professor Michel to provide his opening remarks.
Good afternoon. Many thanks for organizing this debate, especially thanks to Amit, Tiwari, and his collaborators. It's a debate that would require, I think, 3-4 days, to just even lay the foundations of it, in my opinion. So we are asked to compress that into 5 minutes. A good friend of mine said, if you want to capture the attention of the audience, say something outrageous to start with, and that's what I propose to do. So let me jump into the conclusion, because there's no time to develop an argument, and my own off and on cursory study of the concept of secularism in India is that it's a concept that is basically irrelevant, not needed, not useful, and a source of tremendous confusion. So, why do I say that? First of all, let us remember that in the initial constitution of India, there was no concept of secularism. It was not there. And there was a big debate, actually, in 1949 in the Constituent Assembly, and a very interesting and rich debate. I may quote one or two remarks from it if I have time. And finally, it was decided not to use this word. It's only in 1976, I think, 42nd Amendment of the Constitution, that suddenly India was declared to be a secular socialist nation. However, and contrary to anything else in the Constitution of India, the word secularism was not defined. There was no definition given. So what is implied by secularism, especially when we decide not to define it? There are many, and that is the whole problem and the whole source of the confusion, is that this is not one concept of secularism. There are many at work. It's an English word, and there is no equivalent in any Indian language. All the words that are used today from Hindi to Tamil are recent constructions. They are not at all ancient words or even medieval words. There is no equivalent of the concept of secularism. Therefore, we are using an English word. What is the English or European concept? We all know it. It is the separation of state and religion, especially historically speaking, of state and church, where the church was removed, sometimes forcibly, from the political powers and from the educational system. Now, there was no such need to introduce this definition in India because there was never a religious theocracy in India. It never happened. No Hindu king ever tried to impose his own sectarian Hinduism on the population. Ashoka, though so supposedly converted to Buddhism, never tried to impose Buddhism as a state religion. Kharavela, the mighty Jain king of Kalinga, never tried to impose Jainism, etc., etc. So the whole concept of having the theocracy at the helm of the political power did not occur. Then the other definition is that we will have equal treatment of all religions. This is actually the kind of average common denominator used by many people, intellectuals, politicians, and so on. Now, the question, of course, an embarrassing question that is asked immediately is that, fine, very well, let us have equal treatment of all religions. Then why do you introduce immediately Article 29, which immediately creates a division between majority and minority and gives minority rights to conduct, for example, to manage their own educational institutions and to also run their own churches and mosques and whatever it may be, synagogues perhaps, and of course the temples of the Parsis and so on. So why do you create, if you say we want equal treatment of all religions, why do you distinguish between supposedly majority religion and supposedly minority religion and create those divisions? There is obviously a contradiction which we cannot run away from, and therefore this concept of equal treatment of all religions is not, rationally established. And then we say equal respect of all religions. I'm coming to that in, how much time do I have? 1 minute? Wow. So, in 1 minute then, let me say that I regard the concept of secularism as an intellectual fig leaf. Fig leaf, as you know, is something to conceal something that is regarded as shameful. What is this shameful thing? It is, to me, the cultural integration that, historically speaking, Hinduism gave to India. Whatever is false, it did manage to culturally integrate India in a way that, when you speak of unity in diversity, but we emphasize the diversity, which of course needs to be emphasized, but we never really want to focus on unity. So let me, for example, read one quote, and perhaps I'll have only this much of time and I'll pick up later on, which is that India has for ages past been a country of pilgrimages. All over the country you find these ancient places from Badrinath, Kedarnath, Amarnath, high up in the snowy Himalayas down to Kanyakumari in the south. What has drawn our people from the south to the north and from the north to the south in these great pilgrimages? It is the feeling of one country and one culture. Now, it is not a Hindutva fanatic who spoke these words. It is Jawaharlal.
Thank you, sir.
Jawaharlal
You
Nehru.
spoke for 6 minutes.
It was Jawaharlal Nehru in 1961. So I hope to resume later and conclude.
Okay. Now I would like to request Professor Rita to provide her opening remarks.
Years of teaching has taught me that you do not start with an outrageous remark, but you end with one. So I'm hoping that I can match Michel's outrage with my own outrage. In any case, there is an expectation in the student community at least that we are not supposed to agree on anything. Otherwise, students might feel cheated today. So let me first begin by saying that we eat something called American chop suey in India, which neither the Americans nor Chinese know about. We eat something called French fries, which the French don't know about. We eat something called Kashmiri pulao, which the Kashmiris don't know about. What is this relation between certain concepts and words? Just because certain words don't exist in a certain society, is that to say those concepts don't exist? What is the relation between certain conceptual journeys that words make from one culture to another and become in some other society something else? They become Indianized, they get indigenized, they get nativized, they acquire the form and shape of what we might call a mixture of what Gandhi called Sarva Dharma Sambhavana and sometimes doses of Dharma Nirpekshata or Pantha Nirpekshata. So I think I want you to hold this thought that because a word does not exist in our languages does not mean that we do not have any concept whatsoever of living with other religions. And I want to emphasize here that I'm not talking of secularism here as a state ideology, which is what Michel was emphasizing. But I'm talking here of secularism, or I'm talking here of coexistence and of diversity of religion and of a syncretic life by which communities live with each other. So let me give you a quick example. Someone like Saeed Naqvi, who writes this book called Muslim as Other, we may not agree with some of the arguments that he makes. But what we would have to grant is that this extremely well-known journalist from UP talks about a certain Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb. He talks about how, for instance, in his ancestral home, when a child would be born, and this is a Shia Muslim family, the Sohar, the songs for a new child would be sung in bridge, and they would have words like Allah Miya Hamre Miya Ko Diyo Nandlal. This is a Muslim family making an invocation to Krishna. I grew up in what might be called a Hindu house, and yet I cannot distinguish as to which of my legacy is Hindu and which of my legacy came from Guru Nanak, so that in the years of growing up, if my mother said, Nanak kahe chinta mat kariyo, chinta chikhya saman, not that I learned this very well, but the point is that these are mixed legacies that all of us live with. To say that secularism is irrelevant in India, or to say that secularism as living with diverse people, mixing with them in a boundary-less space, unself-consciously participating in their life every day, is not an Indian concept, is to say that India is a theocratic state, and I am not willing to say that. Thank you.
Now the time for moderators' question. The question is to both of you. Does recognizing religious difference ensure the unity of the nation? Ensures the unity of the nation. Okay. Does recognizing religious difference ensure the unity of the nation? Okay, so Professor Michel.
So how much time do I have? A few minutes? Does recognizing religious difference ensure the unity of the nation? Right. So my answer is no, it is not sufficient. It is necessary, and when Professor Rita says living with other religions and coexistence, I said this is part of the Hindu spirit and ethos. I say that by its very nature, Hinduism is inclusive and has, I'm not talking about the social phenomenon at all. I'm talking purely here at the religious level. It has actually not promoted the concept of tolerance, it has promoted the concept of acceptance, that it accepts that there are as many parts as there are human beings, right? So therefore, there is this recognition of religious differences built in Hinduism as far as I understand. And therefore, but if we simply have different religions living, coexisting, then there is still something lacking to my mind, and it is a cultural cement to hold it all together. So that cultural cement, somehow or the other, the Indic religious traditions and spiritualities, and I mean by that also Buddhism and Jainism and Sikhism, whatever was born from this land, it was built into them. But simply having a mosaic of religions or mosaic of culture does not guarantee the unity of the nation, because you need something deeper to create a cement to hold them together. So my model is not a model of a mosaic where you simply juxtapose different elements, whether cultural or religious. My model is that you accept that there is a historically a phenomenon which integrated this land, which made India as one country possible, where, for example, Europe, which had perhaps as much geographical expanse, perhaps as much cultural diversity, as much linguistic diversity, could not be united in one country. So that cultural cement and the historical development that brought it about is what needs to be recognized.
Professor Rita.
Well, my first response is that not recognizing religious diversity ensures the disunity of the nation. As to whether recognizing religious diversity necessarily ensures the unity of the nation, I agree with Michel that it may be one of the elements. And we might also want to talk about what kind of nation are we talking about. A certain kind of a modular nation, as the idea of the nation state is a modern idea which we inherited through a set of historical circumstances in Europe, that may not serve us well for the kind of nation that we are seeking to establish. And I agree with Michel that we might need to look into more Indic traditions to be able to look for a definition of a nation where it is in our idea of religion that something might provide to us an inspiration on how to create an inclusive idea of the nation. Now, the question is, and this is where I sort of differ from Michel, which is, does the inclusiveness or inclusion, I don't know what would be the correct word here, does that Michel attributes to Hinduism, even if we were to concede that only Hinduism had that, and for instance, I think South Asian Islam, South Asian Christianity are also fairly hybrid forms, and they have also been quite inclusive. So I'm not sure I sort of like that kind of othering, but even if we were to grant that for a moment, I think it's sort of, the question that comes to my mind is that to what extent has that inclusive Hinduism stayed with us? Is it under siege today? And maybe at some point, that is where we need to go.
Our second question will be as follows. Has Indian politics redefined secularism to imply minority appeasement? Has Indian politics redefined secularism to imply minority appeasement? Professor Michel.
Well, you have chosen your questions very wisely, I must say. I don't think Indian politics has redefined secularism because it never defined it in the first place. So to me, there is no question of redefinition. But there is, as I said, this confusion that minorities somehow have special rights, right? This is embedded in the original constitution, that minorities will have to be specially protected and given certain privileges, even though the constitution begins by saying there will be no distinction of caste, sex, religion, etc., I forget. Immediately, actually, it starts creating those differences. So therefore, we remain with this built-in contradiction. We cannot run away from it. And many, thinkers, intellectuals, politicians have tried to justify that it is legitimate to give special protection to the vulnerable minorities. Now, of course, it's a big debate whether minorities are vulnerable or not. For example, recently, I think somebody went to the Supreme Court saying that, look, we agree that minorities need special protection. Then, what about the Hindus in Kashmir? They are now in a minority. So can they not be given those special rights under the Constitution? And there is no answer as of now. So we have all kinds of strange situations in India. There are certain districts in Uttar Pradesh. There is at least one in Kerala where Muslims, for example, are in a majority, demographically, by official 2011 census figures. Now, in those districts, who is the majority, who is the minority? Who has the special rights, who has not? So these questions are very touchy, obviously. They are very delicate, and nobody really wants to deal with them. So this is why I say that secularism, by not being defined in the first place, at a strictly legal, we can give many definitions like living together, coexistence, etc., mutual respect. We can give so many definitions, but we'll always land on the fact that there is an initial, I will say, primordial confusion embedded, and nobody really wants to tackle it. This is one.
Professor Rita.
So, although I will not dwell on this much, but I think there is a confusion in the Indian Constitution between Article 28 and Article 29. And I think Michel has pointed that out. Article 28 asks of equidistance from religion, right? Which is the kind of meaning of secularism it inherits from the West, because the Indian Constitution was responding to some of the forms of modernity in the West, which was to say that the state will not be partisan, the state will not support any kind of religious activity and so on, or show any kind of favor. Article 29 says that the state also has a duty to nurture and protect religions of the minority. And I completely agree with Michel that we have tied ourselves up in knots, regardless of which state it is. I think all states, whether it is the Congress or it is the BJP or what have you, have clearly added to this confusion, because this confusion is inherent in the way the Constitution is drafted, and we have not been able to therefore understand whether we want to take the line of the separation of religion and state. So let me just spend 1 minute of the separation of religion and state, which a lot of scholars attribute to the Nehruvian model of secularism, right? Which is to say that this separation is desirable, is possible, and a lot of scholars are now beginning to question whether that kind of separation is indeed possible, considering we are such a religious country. That being said, the fact that anxieties and questions about what kind of nation do we want and what kind of equality do we want in this nation, these questions had begun to come up much before the Indian Constitution was drafted, right? And you had words like tolerance, for instance, which Gandhi did not appreciate very much, and he said, I prefer to use the word equality because tolerance is a very patronizing word. To me, what is important is that the anxieties about secularism, the deficit that we see in the term secularism, whether the deficit is coming from a conceptual flaw or whether it is coming from a bad implementation. Or is the bad implementation an outcome of a blemished concept? I think it is important to engage in it before we announce the death of secularism, for want of a better word. I prefer to use Sarva Dharma Sambhavana. I'm using each time secularism as a certain kind of a compromise word. I prefer to say Indian secularism, or I prefer syncretism and many other concepts, because I think secularism in India is not only a bad case of translation, it is an inadequate original.
Thank you, Professor Michel and Professor Rita. We shall now move on to round 3, where the speakers will get time to ask each other questions. Before that, we shall have 1 minute where we shall allow the speakers to decide questions to ask each other.
My question to Rita will be very simple. It is to comment on a quotation by a great thinker of 20th century India, usually labeled as secular, and we always land with these rather silly labels that, I am a secular Hindu, I am a secular Muslim, and nobody really knows what that means. Is it just broad-minded, liberal? Anyway, this is not a label which he applied to himself. It is a label which is, later on given to him. And he said, this gentleman, whom I will name at the end, he said, India has all along been trying experiments in evolving a social unity within which all the different peoples could be held together while fully enjoying the freedom of maintaining their own differences. This has produced something like a United States of a social federation whose common name is Hinduism. Now, who said this? None else but Rabindranath Tagore. And there's a whole side to Tagore which is never foregrounded because, well, some people are, Anyway, my simple question to Rita is, would you like to comment on, this is a quotation.
I warn students in class all the time that if you have a quotation that comes to you without context, you do not respond. Because given the corpus of writing that Tagore did, I have to humbly concede that I have not read his entire writing, and I would really not respond to one quotation. So you might want to ask me something else. Yeah, sure.
In that case, I will simply modify. Forget it is Tagore. We'll just take this quotation on its own merit. That's all. Just forget it. It doesn't matter.
So you just want me to respond to these words by themselves. Okay. So let me just read this again. India has all along been trying experiments in evolving a social unity within which all the different people could be held together, while fully enjoying the freedom of maintaining their own differences. This has produced something like a United States of a social federation whose common name is Hinduism. Michel, it still seems to me very, very contestable and discursive. First of all, I'm assuming if Tagore was writing this in the 1920s or so, whether he was referring to India as a civilization, he couldn't have been referring to India as a nation state because it did not exist. So clearly he's not talking about things the way you and I would talk about today. And then his statement about a United States of a social federation whose common name is Hinduism. Elsewhere, the same person talks about world citizen. So I don't know how to wrap my head around this.
You are free to skip this question if you want.
How I love you, Amit. Thank you.
Now, Professor Rita will ask the question.
My question to Michel? Yeah, okay. So Michel, the French laïcité or secularism, which provided to many countries in the world some of the early example of being secular, is also quite sort of contentious and contestable. And it has not been faced with the kind of challenges that you have outlined in the Indian context. Why do you think that is the case there? And what lessons do you think we need to learn from French laïcité to perhaps make, should we wish to, our own endeavor of being secular more robust?
If I've understood right, there are two parts in your question. And the first is that the French concept of secularism didn't have to face certain challenges or questions which we are facing here. Why is it so? The answer is very simple from a historical point of view. It is because French secularism was purely a reaction against the Roman Catholic Church political dominance. Sometimes direct, sometimes indirect. It varied through the Middle Ages. But even if it was indirect, it was pulling all the political strings. And there was, in the Age of Enlightenment, as you know very well, a reaction, an anti-ecclesiastic movement, a reaction against, first of all, Christianity as a religion. Its all foundation, theological foundations, rational foundations were challenged. Secondly, a growing movement to separate, to have a state which is not influenced in any way by the churches, and especially in the case of France, the Roman Catholic Church, which was as much a political structure as it was a religious structure. So now, with this in place, and with the fact that Christianity in Europe had erased all pre-Christian religions, it had only to contend with itself. So you had religious wars in Europe, but only within Christianity. In the Middle Ages, you had Protestantism fighting Catholicism, and Catholicism fighting Anglicanism, and Lutheranism fighting Calvinism, and so on and so forth. And these endless internal sectarian fights among Christianity happened, but it did not have to. France was a Christian country, 95% probably in the 19th century, when this concept of laicity or secularism was finally embedded in the French constitution, and then the church was totally removed from political as well as educational influence. So therefore, it didn't have to deal with an Indian context where we had a large Hindu, a large Muslim populations, a substantial Christian, a large Sikh populations, and so on. The social, religious context and historical context is completely different. Now, regarding the lessons that could possibly be learned from French secularism, this is something that France today is debating intensely, because it is not at all sure that this formula is sustainable. And there are very deep rumblings, and not only in the far-right political movements, but there are deep rumblings against what politicians, and across now the whole political spectrum, feel are threats to the secular fabric of France. And I think it's not unique to France, there are other countries in Europe. And the challenges, of course, are triggered by the growing presence of radicalized Islam in a form that threatens. You see, the French philosophy in the 20th century was to integrate whatever religions, communities lived there in a certain undefined French culture and French ethos, which ranged from cuisine to a knowledge of French literature, whatever it was. Now, this meant that communities, for example, the Jewish community, which grew in France from the 16th, 17th century onward, would be primarily French and only Jewish in a kind of private way. So it was understood in French ethos that religion was a kind of private matter which you would not be expected to foreground. And therefore, you could meet a Jew in a street without knowing he was a Jew. You could meet even in the 1960s and 70s, you could meet a Muslim in the street without noticing that he was a Muslim. However, the growth of radical Islam throughout, of course, much of Europe, as we know, now is posing an increasing, and you have a lot of intellectuals, and a lot of books have come out recently in France. And interestingly, initially they were written by supposedly rightist, I don't like all these labels to be frank, but supposedly rightist intellectuals. But now they are also joined by leftist intellectuals who are questioning, what is the formula? How do we integrate people who do not want to be integrated, but who are keen on asserting their separate individuality, separate identity, separate culture, separate practices, and so on, to the extent that you have, for example, French Muslims today sometimes asking for exclusive times in the swimming pools for the ladies, that the doctors attending them must be ladies and not, and things which were inconceivable 20, 30 years ago. So actually, I don't know if we can draw lessons. I would reverse your question, and I would say, cannot French secularism and European multiculturalism as a whole learn lessons from India's experience in cultural and religious coexistence?
Am I allowed? Yeah. While you were speaking, I was also reminded of reading on Turkish secularism, where the challenges it faces and the questions it asks itself don't come from radical Islam, but the questions also come from the fact that the Turkish state has been, according to some scholars, always been non-secular with its non-Sunni population, that it has always been a Sunni state. So I think I merely wanted to sort of flag that, Michel, that while you may be right in some context, I'm not sure whether in every context the challenges to secularism, and it is quite interesting that it has not remained a stable concept anywhere in the world, and it may, many nations will have to revise and revisit as to what kind of secularism they want. But I think in all cases, the challenges to secularism have not come from what you call radical Islam. I simply wanted to flag that by citing to you another country in Europe which also took very heavily from the French laicite. If I may be allowed, Amit, one more a question? No. Can no. Yeah, sure.
No, you are allowed to ask the question.
Just half a second.
Okay.
To simply clarify that I was responding exclusively in the French context, because that was your question. So I do agree that there are other contexts in other countries. But since you asked me about France, I keep myself a little bit informed, distantly informed of what happens in France. I don't have time to read many books, but I read articles which a lot of friends send from different political opinions. And I can see that this is the perceived challenge there. That's all I was trying to convey. Nothing else.
That's fine, thanks. I don't think we should agree too easily. We shouldn't agree too easily. We should put up a masquerade here. Yeah. So, I think I want to come maybe straight on to a question that has been brimming in our minds, and which is about Hinduism. The very fact that Hindu itself as a term was not being used before the 19th century, that as a term it required, when we begin to see certain documents, that about 150, 200 years ago, you will not find too many documents that are using the term Hindu, that we know in our experience of growing up in India that very often our primary identity is that of saying, I am a Brahmin, or that I am a Swaminarayan person, or I am Nanak Panthi, and so on. That with so many concentric circles of identity that we carry, this primacy that the Hindu identity has acquired today, for better or worse, and the fact that it is being mobilized in certain ways to narrow down even what you, Michel, have called as the inclusion of Hinduism, and what you have referred to as a civilizational aspect in some of your other writings and speeches. I want to ask you, since we are here speaking in a more kind of an intimate environment, whether you don't mourn the loss that Hinduism is going through by shrinking, by diminishing some of the breadth, some of the inclusiveness that it has historically come with.
So this is your second question, right?
You have to ask your question.
Two questions.
So she asked a question to you.
Yes?
Okay, so you please respond.
Okay. Because I have asked only one so far. No, that's okay. No issue.
Okay,
no
so
problem.
we
No,
thought
this is-
that you
No,
don't
no,
need moderator for this. Okay.
It's okay. That's, of course, a very important question. And I'm glad you asked it, because it is, of course, somewhere at the back of many of the debates, or sometimes non-debates that are happening in this country. Now, first of all, I want to correct and maybe disagree slightly on, it is true that the word Hindu is rarely used before the 19th century. However, I will show you documents of the 12th century where the word occurs, but it's not used widely. Okay. It is true that Hinduism as a religion is basically defined in the colonial age, and then Hindus adopt it. So there is a kind of an irony and ambivalence there. However, and where I disagree with, you see, certain historians who even, there are even papers, for example, with the title Hindus, an image and identity, which basically say that's extreme. There's an American scholar, I forget his name, who wrote a paper like that. That is a very extreme paper, which basically said that Hinduism just did not exist before the colonial age. Now, this is not acceptable, because we do have a clearly, apart from all the Hindu sampradayas, which sometimes were at loggerheads among themselves, that's a fact, but we do have a shared pool of texts like the Upanishads, the Puranas, the Gita, and above all Mahabharata and Ramayana, which have circulated widely across India and been adopted by all classes and including the so-called tribal groups. So we do have a certain pool of textual foundations for this Hinduism, though it did not use this term to define itself. And we also have practices, especially the institution of pilgrimage, which is of very great importance, and now it's becoming into the academic world as a concept of sacred geography, which is developed more abroad than in India, because here it's considered as something obvious and part of us, so we don't objectify it, but this is also something which, created not only this cultural unity of the geography, but also sent people traveling across India to make sure that they encountered something beyond their linguistic or immediate social identity. So while I agree with you that social identity is very important and sometimes is dominant, at the same time there is a kind of religious, spiritual, ethical complex. In fact, the only way for me to define Hinduism is to call it a religious, spiritual, ethical, social complex. You can't really look at it as just a religion in the narrow sense of the Western sense, for example. So now the second part of your question is, do we not see a loss of that inclusive Hinduism, which promoted the concept of swadharma? So it's not only that there is a universal dharma, but there are infinite dharmas, as many as there are individuals, because it recognized individual differences. You said that tolerance is a slightly patronizing term. In fact, tolerance as a term is created in the midst of intolerant Christianity by the Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, who wrote a treatise on toleration because they were desperately in need of this value. So in India, it's not, you can say equality if you like, but I call it acceptance. It is more acceptance of the fact that you and me are different, therefore we are going to have different paths. Now, I know that the media is concentrating on, and maybe they're doing their job, I don't know, is concentrating on a lot of phenomena of intolerance that we are seeing. How deep this intolerance is, I cannot say. My acquaintance with, let us say, Hindus who regard this Hinduism as a very important part of their life, and I've been lucky to have many such friends across India, especially in the south, because I've lived in the south, is that this let us say, fundamental aspect of Hindu inclusiveness is still very much alive. So I don't know, I can't give you statistics. I cannot tell you so many % of Hindus are turning to fanatics, and so many % are still deeply not only tolerant but acceptant of others. However, I would like to say that there is a counterpart to this question, and this has been also highlighted by a number of intellectuals, that they say if there is a radical Hinduism, it is nothing but a form of Semitization of Hinduism. In other words, Hinduism is kind of adopting the defects and faults of radical religions elsewhere. And it is true, and at the end of the day, we have to confront it. I know that these are extremely politically incorrect questions to be debated, but we have to finally see that there is a fundamental difference between two categories of religion. One is Christianity and Islam, which both claim to have universal truth. If you speak to theologians of this religion, for example, in 2001 in United Nations, there was a motion pushed by Swami Dayananda Saraswati, the Vedantic scholar who passed away, to say that all religions have equal access to the truth. And the Roman Catholic Church refused, and the Pope made a comment which is actually very consistent with the dogmatic foundation of the Roman Catholic Church, saying that while we are willing to respect other religions, we cannot sign a declaration saying that all religions are paths to the truth, because it's only Catholicism which is the repository of the truth. I can fish out that declaration, but more or less this is the gist of it. So we have a problem with exclusivist religions, which of course we do know that Christianity, Islam, though they have this exclusiveness, we do know that there have been a lot of fringe developments. There have been Christian mystics who detached themselves from this dogmatic exclusivism. We have Sufism in Islam and other movements. Nevertheless, the core of the religion does, it is the word of God. There is one founder, one book, one set of dogmas. And in Hinduism, You do not have a founder, you do not have one book, you do not have any set of dogmas whatsoever. So I think that this kind of deep identity of Hinduism is still alive in India. How long it will remain alive? Well, it depends on the goodwill and clarity, I would say, of our intellectual and our political classes.
So you can ask a question to her.
I can ask a question?
Yeah.
I think I will pass just now, or else, okay, let me, these were quotations I was supposed to use in my initial 5 minutes. Of course, I could not. So I'm going to ask you to comment on a saying of Sri Aurobindo, who's supposed to, he's regarded sometimes, of course, he's a great spiritual master of the 20th century, but he has been sometimes called a kind of giving a new vision of Hinduism. I'm not sure that was his intention, by the way. But in a letter, I will give you the context because you're right. We need the context. The context is that in 1920, after 10 years of retirement from active politics, he withdrew from Bengal, and the Swadeshi movement in Bengal came to Pondicherry and devoted himself exclusively to his spiritual sadhana. But then he was called and invited by Tilak and his associates to rejoin the Congress as the president of the Congress for a certain session. And he replied, there's a long letter where he explains why he's not going to accept the invitation. He says he's very much honored and so on. But he explains that now he wants to put all his energy on new spiritual foundations, right? However, he explains that he has no contempt for politics, and he regards it as a legitimate part of life and even of spiritual life. So this is in this context that he says, there is to me nothing secular. All human activity is for me a thing to be included in a complete spiritual life. Comments, please.
So, thanks for that context, Michel. From what I understand here, I think Aurobindo is defining sort of secular here as in something that is outside religion. In seculum, what is called in Latin profane, outside the religious. And to that extent, I think what he's saying is that the sacred and profane time, which has its roots in the world of Christianity, and etymologically, we treat secularism as coming from the word seculum, as in the ordinary Latin word for the century or age that took on a special meaning when applied to a profane time. To say there is nothing secular is to say there is nothing so completely independent of religion. And I can't have a quarrel with that. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we are not sufficiently in disagreement.
Okay, so we can have one more exchange of questions, then we will open it to the audience. Okay, so now we are opening this to the audience, and so a special note is that I request audience to keep their question brief and to the point, and please refrain from giving discourse.
Thanks, Amit, for that discourse comment, because I was going to say something, but then I'll refrain. The thing is, being true to my literary background, there was something which I was focusing on, the way interchangeably the word inclusiveness and inclusion was being used by both of the speakers. But I want really you to comment on the inherent difference between the two words. Because my opinion is inclusion does have a tendency of power equation, and inclusiveness is about an inherent quality of inclusivity. And also, how if now that you can define what the two are, pit them against diversity, because I feel diversity is more about quantity of actually seeing existence of coexistence of different elements, but inclusion
So,
and inclusiveness.
no.
So the question is,
No, we-
okay, just okay.
Yeah.
Sorry for this, but then okay. So my last question is. I think diversity is about being invited to a party, but inclusion is about telling someone to dance for you, right? So I really want because I feel I have misgivings about how the words are being used interchangeably. So,
I don't see much of a difficulty. As you said, I think you answered the question yourself very nicely. Inclusiveness is the inherent quality, you said, yes, that is there at the core of a certain belief system, a built-in ability to include other systems, other views. And this is inclusiveness. Inclusion is a historical development, if at all it happens, right? So if I want to take us back to the phenomenon of Hinduism, the inclusiveness is built because of the elasticity of Hinduism. In fact, it's as I've often said in many lectures and writings, and sometimes courses, you can't even say where Hinduism begins and where it ends. You cannot give the boundary lines. The beliefs are extremely elastic and contain sometimes totally contradictory schools of thought. The actual practices and rituals, can include a temple where, like in Rajasthan, where rats are worshipped by the thousands. That is also part of Hinduism. And when I tell my friends in Tamil Nadu, they say, rats, how is it possible? But it is possible. So there is basically no, you can't really, socially, it is something that has gone into the village, into even many tribal communities, and we know historically the cultural exchanges that took place. So it is kind of built in this system. This is the point I wanted to make. Whether in actual manifestation, today, tomorrow, this inclusiveness is actually respected is a different issue.
Can I respond to Prerna? Yeah. No, thanks for pointing that. I think inclusiveness is perhaps a more robust ongoing process as well. It doesn't sort of say we have included whom we have to, but now our list is closed. I think what worries me today, Prerna, is that that's what we are doing to Hinduism, that we have included what we could. I think, I agree with Michel that you could have rats at one place and you could have Vishnu at another and you could have Lakshmi at another. But Hindus also used to go to dargahs. What happened to that inclusiveness? I think that the inclusion list is sealed and those processes are not happening today.
Next.
So there are two questions for Michel.
Ask one question at a time. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so my first question, and if there is time, I'll come to the second one. So, Michel, I tend to disagree with your argument that the Indian Constitution has, on one hand, said that it will respect all religions and then, gives special minority rights. I mean, how is it different from the Constitution giving equal opportunity to all, but at the same time giving reservation to certain sections of the society based on their caste? So it is quite natural that in a diverse country like India, you will have to give, rights of protection to certain marginalized sections of the society. It's like the affirmative action policy. Now, the minority rights are essentially, we speak about them because, as the Sachar committee says, the educational, social, and economic status of the Muslim community in this country is just slightly better than the situation of the Dalits. And yeah, so essentially, It is for this reason that I think it is justified to talk about minority rights in this country.
So what is your question? Please come to the
No,
question.
I think I've got the
So
question now.
this is just a comment. Yeah.
Okay.
So, well, I think we will disagree on this. I consider that it was a deep mistake. If you're going to give the rights, I'm not at all objecting to those rights being given to the minorities. I'm only saying give them also to the majority. And in fact, I'll go much further. I'm, almost transgressing all boundaries. I personally feel that India made a mistake by keeping the colonial categories of majority and minorities. Because, in fact, if you look closely, some minorities may be cohesive. Maybe the Parsis, I don't know, to some extent. But the majority is not cohesive. It never acts as one. And as Rita rightly said, it will be more the community which is the dominant feature in the identity. They will say, perhaps I'm, a Rajput, before they say I'm a Hindu. So in fact, we could have defined India as a land of, infinitely diverse communities, some of which may happen to be Muslim, others may happen to be Jewish, and others may happen to be Hindus. So I think there was a double blunder that you adopt wholesale, uncritically, the division between majority and minority when we know full well that the British powers played on these divisions to maintain their rule. We know all that. It's heavily documented historically. There's no question. So we accept that uncritically, and then we give rights to one and not to the other. Give the same rights. Let the Indian Constitution pull out from control on, say, Hindu educational institutions and temples. Why not? Leave the temples to be run by the devotees, maybe some well-established trust. The demand to me is quite legitimate. You cannot run away from this. You say equal rights, but we deny the equal rights. I don't think it is tenable. This is my stand.
So, if I understood this interaction correctly between Sandeep and Michel, are we saying, Michel, that, and let me see if Sandeep sort of feels this is that if we were not to, like the Sachar committee does, take this blanket category of Muslims, and if we were to actually break it down, and you might have Sayyids and you might have Khans who are economically, socially well-to-do, but you might have, let's say, Sheikhs, and you may have Ansaris who are not well-to-do. A large number falls into artisan communities. So we were not to say that a large number of Muslims are not doing well, but we were to say that a large number of the following communities are not doing well. And if then the state were to extend special sort of help for those communities, that would be fine, right, Michel? We are not, yeah.
Oh, Michel, this question is for you. So you have kept talking about inclusiveness of Hinduism, right?
A little louder, if possible.
Please keep it close.
Okay, yeah. Okay, Michel, so you've been talking about the inclusiveness of Hinduism. So in my life, going around the slums of Mumbai, I found many people who are Christians. So they are converts from certain classes of society. So it's not that this was forcible conversion in any sense. It's because they felt segregated or sort of ostracized from the religion they belonged to. I mean, why? And also, what were the type of incentives they had? They could get schooling, they could get medical facilities and other things as sort of a welcoming feeling. So where is all this inclusiveness that you talk of in Hinduism?
Thanks, Ravi. I did say that I was speaking at the level of belief systems and not going into the structure, the social structure. Now, at the level of the belief system, you have, for example, if you come to Kerala, you have this Mata Anandamayi, who is revered as Amma, all right? She comes from a fisherman community, the lowest of the low perhaps in Kerala. And yet she can rise to the highest stature of, let us say, as a spiritual something, leader, teacher, whatever you want, and be accepted instantly by the society at large. So I can give many such arguments to show that at the level of the belief system, yes, the inclusiveness does exist, but at the social level, it is a different story. I agree with you, and therefore, if we are going to discuss that, we need a separate debate on the caste system and its evolution through history. What led to these, rigidification of the divisions in the society and so on and so forth. But please note at the end of the day, that even, please go into those slums and you will still see these people attached to that belief system most of the time. So there is a dichotomy, but there is also a compartmentalizations of the two issues. They are not at the same level at all. So we have to deal with them differently.
I think I want to slightly add to that point you made. I'm not sure I agree with Michel here. I mean, because if you convert it to Islam or to Christianity, and you have not been able to shrug off, because it's not as if your belief system is like a pair of clothing that you can put away, and now that you've worn another pair of clothing, just because you have not been able to shrug it off, does not mean that it makes that particular system so benign. While you were in it, it was not benign, which is why you're right, that sometimes there is a need for you to sort of say that this gives me too much misery and stigma, and I need to adopt a more dignified identity. I think I do believe that while I'm not in full agreement with this church-state wall of separation kind of secular mode in the West, I think we do need to adopt a different understanding there, and I believe very strongly in Sarva Dharma Sambhavana and so on. I do think that we need a healthy dose of Ambedkar along with Gandhi, so that we do remember that while it is important that what Gandhi calls, we must remember the imperfections of our own religion, and we must be open to criticizing those without feeling insecure, just as we should also therefore feel empowered enough to criticize some other religion. Once we do that to our own religion, we might be taken more seriously if we do that to another religion as well. And Ambedkar reminds us as to what are some of the very fundamental and structural problems of Hinduism. I think we cannot talk about Hinduism without talking of caste, but I think it's important to keep sort of both views in mind, and we need some kind of a combination of two. So thanks for bringing that.
My question is to Rita, ma'am. Ma'am, you defied the idea of modern nation-state theory. Then why do you want to even acknowledge the word secularism, which had been propelled and institutionalized by modern state theory, where it meant to be to prevent the state, to prevent the churches not to intervene to achieve their economic and political goals? Can I repeat?
Yeah, sure.
Ma'am, you defied the idea of modern nation-state theory. Then why do you even want to acknowledge the word secularism, which had been propelled and institutionalized by the modern nation-state theory, where it meant to be prevent the state churches not to intervene in the matters of politics and economics?
So your question is in the Indian context?
Yes, in Indian context.
In the Indian context?
I'm saying why don't we make it irrelevant, as Michel said?
Why do we need this irrelevant word? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying then it should be irrelevant in Indian context, as because the secularism word, when it founded in Western concept, it meant to separate churches from state, that they should not intervene the affairs of to achieve their political and economic goals.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm arguing for, at the moment, I'm using the word secular constantly provisionally. I'm constantly reminding us that some of its ingredients go to the West. We might want to either use the pre-qualifier Indian secularism, or we might want to use some of the neighboring terms which have emerged from India. But that being said, let me also qualify that I'm not a big theorist of a dichotomy of Indian and Western. I'm not propagating here that everything Indian is good and everything Western is bad. I don't want to posit that dichotomy either. So I'm not rejecting secularism in its entirety, but I'm not adopting in its entirety. I'm circumspect, and I'm saying that I find the misuse, the abuse, the use of secularism in everyday context very contentious. I find it more easy to resonate when I look at people, when I look at the lives of the people, and when I look at some of the most unself-conscious and simple and syncretic ways by which this society has lived for centuries and centuries, and the fact that that fabric is tearing apart today, that breaks my heart. And that is where I'm beginning to sort of wonder as to what do we need to do. If by invoking the word secular, if we will stop forcing some people and thrusting down the throats of some people certain ideologies, then maybe we need to invoke it. I don't know. But I think what worries me today is this tearing apart of the social fabric.
My question to Rita ji, that I hear that Ganga Yamuna Tehreek and Sardharm Sambhav.
Could you hold the mic closer, please?
I hear Ganga Yamuna Tehreek and Sardharm Sambhav but many times from high-profile person like you. How much these words partition Hindu in two communities, Sanatan and Muslim, by knocking their door time to time by telling that you are from certain community.
It's not about partition. I don't know. Okay, let me just clarify. You are not asking me any question about the partition of India, right? It's not about that. What you're saying is that the word like Sarva Dharma Sambhavna and Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb, what relationship does that have with the kind of divisions we see between Sanatan Hindu
and Muslim?
And Muslim? Are you saying?
No, I am saying that Hindu, by saying that you are from certain community, by using Ganga Yamuna Tehreek and Sardharm Sambhav, because we are all living in India are Hindus, and by telling that Ganga Yamuna Tehreek and Sardharm Sambhav, why we partition Hindus in two communities?
Okay, let me understand if you and I understand Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb and Sarva Dharma Sambhavna exactly the same way.
Yeah,
so please allow me to make sure that you and I understand that exactly the same way. So by Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb, I meant a kind of overlapping mixture life where you can't tell which practice came from Hinduism, which came from Islam, which came from Christianity, the way religions mix with each other unself-consciously. You understand? So जिस तरह से कोई हिंदू दरगाह में भी जाता है, कोई गुरुद्वारे में जाता है, that is what I meant by Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb. Sarva Dharma Sambhavna is a specific credo by which I was referring to Gandhi. And Gandhi says that in India we need to use a term like this because our secularism is not about putting religion away, it is about becoming, if you like, secular through religion, through compassion. So I hope we have understood these terms exactly the same way. Then I can take the second part of what you're saying.
Yeah.
We have, right? So that division you mentioned between Sanatan and that would run contrary to what we have just agreed upon. That division would not fit into this particular philosophy. In fact, that division, the one about Sanatani, would follow a very different stream of thought. It would follow a very different strand, an ideological strand. That is not the strand that I'm either subscribing to or I'm propagating, and I have not even mentioned it. So, is that okay?
No.
Professor Danino, would you like to respond to that? Would you like to respond to that? Okay, we shall move on to the next question.
Ma'am and sir, I am quoting a sentence from Baba Saheb Ambedkar's book, Partition or Pakistan or Partition of India. So the context is Mapilla Rebellion. So Baba Saheb says, Mr. Gandhi has been very punctilious in the matter of condemning any and every act of violence. But Mr. Gandhi has never protested against such murders. This attitude of the minorities is quite understandable. What is not understandable is the attitude of Mr. Gandhi. So my question is, with whom do you agree, Gandhi or Ambedkar?
So there is an Ambedkar Jayanti lecture tomorrow. Shall we discuss it over there?
My question is to Michel Danino. So this is a direct question in the context of the present political regime in India, the way state functions right now in India. Firstly, do you think any form of cultural homogenization is required for nation building? And the related question is, what role do you think the present Indian state is playing in this context?
You asked, if I understood well, is it desirable to have cultural homogenization? Homogenization.
Is it required,
Is it
for
required?
nation building? Is it required for...
Well, obvious answer is no.
Okay.
Of course it's not required, because India was built into a nation without homogenization. Why should it be required? And it will be an impossible task anyway to homogenize India. It cannot. There will be built-in resistance. Even if somebody tried, was misguided enough to try. And did you say cultural homogenization?
Yes.
Yes. I think it is an impossible task. It is not going to happen, because the very fabric of the society and social beliefs are going to organically resist that. Whether there is such an attempt today, I do not know. We would have to see if it comes from clear evidence, such as new laws or such as new, we'll have to see whether certain, attempts are made to change the constitution or whatever it may be. But until we have firm evidence, I know that the press is day in and day out baying at, this government's attempts to supposedly radicalize in particular the Hindu population. I don't personally have such fears, but we'll have to wait and see. I am not part of the government of India, so I cannot tell you what its intentions are.
No, I'm saying, what role do you think the present, what role do you think the present Indian state play or in this process? Do you think the state is resisting it, or do you think it is indifferent towards the process? Or do you not agree with, you may not agree with me, that's a different thing, but what role do you think the state is playing in this process?
No, I don't really know. What I think is that what the state should try to do is to clarify this confusion about secularism and majority and minority. I'm coming back to the same point basically. I say that we would gain a lot of national clarity if we knew what we are talking about. Right now, you can see across the spectrum, everybody who wants to have some acceptability will start saying, I am secular, I am liberal, without having any clue as to what he or she is really saying or meaning. So today we've heard a certain number of definitions of this term. What do we choose? Do we choose all of them? Anything is fine with me, but let us be clear. And I think that since this debate is intensifying at the national level, I think the state could do this very usefully to lead the debate and, ask, for example, for the word secularism in the constitution, either to be defined or to be removed. That would be a very useful step, in my opinion. I don't know if that is really what you had in mind.
Hi, Michel. I have a small comment about Your example of how Hinduism is elastic, that it is very inclusive. Now, my comment is about you talking about Hinduism as being big-hearted, accommodating different points of view, or accommodating, being inclusive, the idea that Hinduism is inclusive. And I was shocked to hear you giving the example of rats in the temple, that there are rats in a temple in Rajasthan. I mean, I know that's an example, but you know, there are a lot of temples where Dalits are not allowed. So I found that very interesting that you gave the example of temples in Rajasthan allowing rats in the feeding in the temple, but there are temples.
This is the Deshnok temple near Bikaner.
No, I know it's true, but I'm just giving this. I was quite.
There are about 20,000 resident rats are estimated.
I know. I think it's a good example that Hinduism had to take an example of a non-human small animal to prove that we are inclusive, whereas you sort of don't allow a large number of low-caste people to enter temple.
You misunderstand.
No, I understood, but the example was disturbing me. And that's it. That's the point.
The example is simply to show the elasticity of the kind of actual religious practices that can be counted within the concept of Hinduism. That is all. And I think it's a good example.
This will be the last question of this session.
No, I think I would just respond to that comment and then ask my question. I think there were numerous examples of the comment that you made about rats and Dalits. I could cite 50,000, I mean, not 50,000, but many examples of all other faith. Look at what happens in the name of tolerant Islam and whatever happens in terms of women who were abducted, 10,000 women who were abducted right next to, Syrian border. The whole village was abducted and whatever things were happened. So, I mean, in any case, I would pick up one example over the other, which just says about diverse things that happen in the, and everybody can say. My question, especially, and I don't know who it is to, but I had read this book long back, "Escape from Freedom," by Erich Fromm, where he was saying one of the biggest reasons that the Nazi thing happened was that, of the overall social milieu of the societies which had large communities suddenly become, individualized, very individual in their capacity as nuclear aspirations grew. Do you think this rise of so-called non-secular I don't know, because I don't know how you would define that word, but rise of fanaticism has something to do with our overlying social structures? Why is it that these forces are taking overall place? Does it have something to do with those same forces which Erich Fromm was talking about when he talked about genocide that happened in Second World War?
Yes.
Question is to me?
Either one of, I don't know.
See, I just want to make a point here that you can always highlight examples of, exclusion or fanaticism. You can find a few if you want, but you can also do the opposite, and you can find examples of positive movements which have emerged from within. For example, there is in Pune a movement which started initiating women into priesthood for Hindu temples, right? Now, initially there was a little resistance from the society. It is this, I forget the name, something Prabodhini in Pune. And they have initiated, in a few years, they initiated more than 5,000 women into priesthood. Normally, this is not allowed by the Dharma Sutras, right? It's not allowed by the Hindu orthodoxy, if there is an orthodoxy. That orthodoxy also will be difficult to define, but anyway. And yet, it very soon gained social acceptance. And in fact, there was feedback from the worshippers that they found the women priests more sincere in their performance of the rituals than the men priests. This was a common, something which I read. You can go to more deeper social reformers, like in Kerala, for example, Narayana Guru, who was dealing with the intolerance and exclusion of the Eravar community. And finally, he ended though he was championing the cause of the Eravar community, he ended being an accepted spiritual leader for the entire society, not just for the Eravar. So this phenomenon has to be understood, how the society from time to time keeps throwing up. It's in a completely organic, unpredictable manner, figures or movements which are exactly the opposite of phenomena of exclusion or what some people here have called fanaticism.
Professor Rita, would you like to respond to this question? Okay. So if you want to make any final comment, you are free to make any concluding remarks.
How much time are you giving?
We have 6 minutes.
Okay.
Total.
All right, so I'm going to take this liberty. I'm an ethnographer and I'm a storyteller. And I'm going to end this with a story because there is a reason why this debate has been organized. The initiative has come from students, but it's clear that there are worries around us. It's clear that there are anxieties around us. This doesn't come out of nowhere. And I think let's remember as to, at the heart of these worries, what exactly is happening here. And I think I wish to communicate this through a story by someone called Meenal Dave, a writer from Gujarat, who writes the story which I've translated, and in English it's called Nightmare. And so you've got this very middle class or upper middle class Hindu, somewhat liberal, well-meaning woman who works in what looks like Baroda and goes to what looks like Ahmedabad, and I'm saying this on the basis of the local train she takes. She comes, there's been a curfew, there have been communal riots in the city. There's not a sign of life on the roads. The curfew has just been lifted, and each time there is a curfew after communal riots. And then when it opens up, you find huge traffic. People go out to eat ice cream, to do shopping, to tell themselves everything is normal. On one such day, she decides to take a train from Baroda to Ahmedabad. She finds herself on a railway station, and it's completely empty because the train has just left. While she's sitting down, thinking I'll have to take the next train, someone comes and sits beside her. And she sees only this flutter, only this rustle of cloth, and it's a burqa. And she hasn't even seen the person's face. She only sees the burqa, and she thinks, oh my God, am I safe? Who's this sitting next to me? Why is this person carrying a bag with her? Why is this person's hands looking so harsh? Is that even a woman or is this a man? And then she chides herself and reminds herself that no, I'm a liberal person. I shouldn't be even thinking like this. But then she tells herself, but times are such, you can't trust anybody. And then the train comes, she boards the train, and this burqa-clad woman also boards the train, and they are sitting across each other. The train moves on. There's another sabzi wali, a vegetable person, who's sleeping away blissfully, and our protagonist, this well-meaning Hindu woman, she looks at this burqa-clad woman and she thinks, uski aankhon mein bhi kuch dikh raha hai. Like from the slits of those eyes, I can see she'll do something to me. She's not able to sit calmly. She constantly feels something will happen to me. And she falls asleep at some point. And then she realizes, koi usko jhanjhod raha hai. Someone is shaking her up. और उसकी आंखें खुलती है तो वो सामने देखती है वही बुरखे वाली औरत उसको बोल रही है मेरा स्टेशन आ गया अच्छा था कि आप थे वरना मैं तो इतनी डरी हुई थी. And when she hears this and she says to this woman, नहीं डर क्यों रही हो मैं तुम्हारे साथ हूँ. And she comes and drops off this woman to the station. वही थैला जो पहले लग रहा था इस थैले में क्या होगा कुछ है तो नहीं उसके अंदर. She gives that thela to this woman and she thinks the thela is so light. And she gives it and the train moves on. I think I want to underscore here for students and for all of us as teachers that whatever meaning of secularism we believe in, and neither Michel nor I have defined secularism today, which alone should tell you that not only is there not one meaning of secularism, there isn't even one way of being secular. But one thing we must know, that we have a duty not to contribute to a politics of hatred. We have a duty not to demonize the other. We must remember, like this woman did, that there is a human body across, that woman must have also suffered the same vulnerability, the same fear in 2002 or in 1992 or whatever hell that might be, that at that point there is a woman body speaking to a woman body. One is not a Hindu and one is not a Muslim, and we must refuse to live with those reductive identities. I think we must remember to do that, and we must remember not to settle with anything less. This is the very least we have to do.
Thank you. Professor Michel, you want to say something?
My concluding words are going to sound horribly flat in comparison, because I agree with many things, of course, that Rita is expressing, but I disagree still on the need of this word secularism, because if it means coexistence, let us use the word coexistence. If it means mutual respect, let us use the phrase mutual respect. If it means syncretism, as you mentioned once, let us use this word. If it is, then of course when you say becoming secular through religion, that is something that I can no longer comprehend. And in fact, I think still I maintain that, in my opinion, a lot of national confusion has been introduced, not only by the term, but by the maintenance of these Muslim, Hindu categories in the Constitution. And the Constitution would have served India much better if there had never been any talk of Hindu or Muslim in it. And it's unfortunate, in my opinion, that this wisdom did not prevail, but I can understand the context in which, of course, the debate took place. And I will just close with two quotations from the Constituent Assembly debate in 1949, where Jawaharlal Nehru himself said, "Another word is thrown up a good deal, this secular state business. May I beg in all humility those gentlemen who use this word often to consult some dictionary before they use it. It is brought in at every conceivable step." Just a minute, I've done. "At every conceivable step and at every conceivable stage, I just do not understand it." This is 1949, of course. And then there was P.S. Deshmukh, 2 lines, who was a senior functionary, also intervening in the Constituent Assembly debates, and who said, "The specious, oft repeated and nauseating principle of secularity of the state, I think we are going too far in this business of secularity." So my only plea has been, if we have a clear concept of what secularism is, we can use the concept instead and not allow what you yourself called abuse of the term secularism. Let's remove the abuse by going straight to the core concepts and not hiding behind a hazy and undefined term. I did not define secularism because I don't need to define it. I don't feel the need for the word at all. This is my conclusion.
So I would like to conclude this by saying that equal treatment for all religions not rationally established. This point is well taken. Probably we need to study more about Article 28 and 29. We do have certain cultural cement which allows us to live together. There are 2 kinds of cultural cement which allowed Indians to live together. First, which Professor Michel pointed out regarding ancient Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism. But there is another cultural cement which should also be recognized, that is Sufism, a hybridized version of religions. As Professor Rita pointed to, Sohar songs by Muslims in praise of Lord Krishna. And also a point by Professor Michel about not all minorities are covered in the term minority, like that of Kashmiri Pandits. So we should also talk about their rights. And my thanks to Cultural Secretary, General Secretary Rajat Gupta, Devarsh ji for all their help and support. Special thanks to Dyotna Banerjee and Krupa Shah for background research. I am also grateful to the speakers and the audience who participated in this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Amit, and thank you, Rita.